Most of the news media reporting on Muslims and Islam in Europe, and most of the rest of the world for that matter, we tend to see reporting that focuses on people who are committing violent acts. If you take in aggregate all the groups that we hear about in the news, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, there may be 100,000 people. That's a tiny portion of the total number of Muslims in the world. And by contrast, there's just, for example, one group in Europe that's doing this sort of adaptive activism. It's called FEMISO, the European Federation of Muslim Youth and Student Organizations. It has 120,000 members in each of the EU countries. So the millennial Muslims in Europe are sort of a wildly diverse group. It's men, women, observant, non-observant, gay, straight. The interesting thing from my perspective is this first sort of very grassroots-oriented form of civic engagement, seeing themselves as sort of a hybrid generation. They're drawing sort of cultural DNA from both the larger society and from their parents' cultures. News consumers themselves have created the situation where they find themselves wondering, well, where are the mainstream Muslim voices? You don't see them because you don't want to see them. Sweden is probably the best case in point because Sweden takes in a huge number of refugees. The city where I visited, Malmö, is the southernmost major city in Sweden, and it's the primary point of entry for migrants who are making their way north towards Sweden. Literally the first thing that my fixer asked me when he came to pick me up in my hotel was, "Do you want to go to Malmö's no-go zone?" And I said, "Oh, of course." The thing that really struck me is it's incredibly green. It's a remarkably green place. Well-maintained playgrounds, kitchen gardens. It was very village-like. There was something really charming about it. And all of that has to do with work that this particular cohort of Muslims is doing specifically for newcomers. There's this great kid, Kevin Shakir. He told me this great story about doing social media coverage of this facility called Malmö Live. And this group of young people, kind of like young anarchists, they're like lighting torches and that kind of thing. And he sees a guy from his neighborhood, so a Muslim guy from his neighborhood in the group, and he leaves the studio, goes out, walks up to these people who are carrying torches, looks at the guy and said, "What are you doing here?" "I'm working." He's confronting not only the sort of racism of the society, the larger society around him, he's also sort of confronting the sort of resistance to change in his own community. And I found that like all across the board, like all the characters I met have this sort of, fierceness about them in critiquing not only larger European culture, but also their own cultures.
They believe they don't deserve the same rights, and they plan to vote against European equality laws that would protect them, like anti-discrimination laws or immigration laws.
One of the things that I've looked into is sort of the history of mainstream news media coverage of LGBT people in the US. And as recently as the 1960s, you could see headlines in, for example, the New York Times that tended to sort of appeal to one of two emotional registers around the issue of gay people. It was either, fear or pity. When I really started looking analytically at coverage of Muslims and Islam in the mainstream press in the US and Europe, I realized the same was true, that most of the stories appealed to, this very narrow range of emotional registers, and other news values like, surprise or respect just didn't figure into the mix. So it was sort of gratifying for me to be able to offer a corrective to that sort of narrow casting in news media coverage, but also to sort of lift up voices that weren't being heard.